All right, our next speaker this afternoon is a native of Fort Worth, Texas. He has earned his degree in journalism from the University of North Texas and attended graduate school at Texas Tech in Lubbock. When I was young, I used to call that Lubbock. He has worked for various newspapers, including the Fort Worth Star Telegram, where beginning in 1968, he served as a police reporter and general assignments reporter covering stories locally in Europe and the Middle East. All right, after a leave of absence to serve with 4th Army Intelligence Unit during the Vietnam War, he became a military and aerospace writer and an investigative reporter. Beginning in 1976 until his retirement in 2007, he taught a course on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy at the University of Texas at Arlington. In 1989, his book Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy, was published to critical acclaim and reached the New York Times bestseller list, the nonfiction bestseller list also. It became the basis for Oliver Stone's film JFK, on which he served as chief consultant for both the film and the screenplay. In May 1997, his in-depth investigation of UFOs, which he published in his book Alien Agenda, was published and eventually translated into several foreign languages, becoming the top-selling nonfiction UFO book in the entire world. From 2000 to 2007, he taught a course on UFOs at the University of Texas at Arlington, becoming perhaps the first person to teach about UFOs at a college level. Other books that he has written include Rule of Secrecy, The Terror Conspiracy Revisited, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, The $1 Trillion Conspiracy, and his latest book, Our Occult History, concerns the origins of humankind and the possibility of extraterrestrial intervention. He's won several Associated Press writing and photography awards, including the Aviation Aerospace Writers Association National Writing Award and Newsmaker of the Year Award from the Fort Worth chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. In 1993, he received Freedom Magazine's Human Rights Leadership Award, and in 2015, he was presented a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Consciousness Life Expo. He's appeared on every television station, every radio station, every cable channel. I'm just looking at the list. And he has spoken at this conference before as well. I mean, that's probably your proudest moment, right? All right. I got to tell you, the first time that I met our next speaker, him and I were on the speaking docket in Pensacola, Florida, if you remember. And there's almost always a panel discussion at these conferences. If you've been to some of them, you know that. We used to have one at this one also. And so Jim and I were sitting on the panel discussion. We were kind of down on the end of the table right next to each other. And nobody was asking us any questions. I think, Jim, you got a couple. I didn't get any questions. Everybody was asking, I don't know, Whitley or Linda or somebody, you know. And so we're bored. All right, this is not good. All right. So we're sitting up at the table. We started acting up. Okay. Now, our mics were off. Nobody could hear what we were saying. But the moral of the story is that time I spent with you at that table made me love you as one of the best researchers, because this guy has a fantastic biting sense of humor, just, you know, sarcasm. And on top of that, he's probably one of the biggest excrement disturbers in the business. Okay? Now, one thing we love is a good excrement disturber. Okay? So, join me in welcoming Jim Marrs.
Hey, all right. Thanks, bud. Oh, boy. With friends like that, I don't need enemies. All right. This is great to be with y'all today, and it's great to be back here at the Ozark UFO Conference. I have lots of good memories here, especially, I think, from what they call it, the Texas Room, or the Longhorn Bar. Yeah, you bet. Yeah, lots of late night discussions there. Okay, there's so many things I could talk about today, but I think y'all might be hearing about my experiences with remote viewing aliens. First, let's qualify the audience. Everybody, if you know what I'm talking about with remote viewing, raise your hand. Oh, yay, good. Okay, maybe I don't have to go too far into that then. Let me see if I can get this thing programmed up. So, first I'll start off by telling you that I'm not a babe in the woods about this stuff. Long before I knew about remote viewing and long before I made some really high-level contacts, as a journalist for about 50 years now, I have been very fortunate in having the opportunity to speak with many people who are very knowledgeable about the UFO situation. Some of these you probably recognize: Dr. Edward Teller, father of the H-bomb, Colonel Philip Corso, I'm sure you're familiar with his book. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, I interviewed him at one time. This was his post-pro-UFO stage, okay? He started off hired by the government to go around and poo-poo UFOs, you know, but he slowly came to the realization that there really was something there. And he was in his latter years when I interviewed him, and he was quite positive about the fact that we have been visited by non-human intelligences. I think he got in big trouble when he went to Michigan way back there, and a whole college had a UFO experience, including the dean of the college. And they sent Hynek there, the government did, to try to tell them that what they saw they didn't see. And he held a press conference and explained to the world that they had seen swamp gas. And that really got him in trouble. But there's an interesting side to that, because at that time, those good people in Wisconsin, they got very upset about the fact that they were told they couldn't tell a UFO from swamp gas. So they contacted their congressman, Gerald R. Ford, and that was a mistake, I guess. But this is interesting because Ford at the time got up in Congress and said, this is an affront to the sensibilities of my people, and I'm going to hold a committee, and we're going to have a committee hearing, and we're going to study, and we're going to find out what the truth is about UFOs. Well, that never happened, did it? But he got appointed president. So I guess in Washington it serves you well not to look at UFOs. Bob Dean, I think most of y'all know Bob Dean. He was the highest level enlisted man. He was, I think, a sergeant major, I think, in NATO over in Europe. And as such, he was allowed to look at some of the secret books and stuff. And he is a grand fellow, and he and I have gotten to be very good friends. Unfortunately, he's really getting along in age, I guess, as we all are. And but he's really sharp, and he knows his stuff. Bruce Maccabee, he's kind of a photographic expert, has dealt with a lot of government projects having to do with UFOs. And since he's kind of connected to the government, he kind of plays it close to the chest and he's not out front and he's not outspoken about all this, but privately he'll tell you, yeah, there's some really neat stuff and strange stuff going on. Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who just recently passed away, that was a loss. Sixth man to walk on the moon. He has been very out front. He not only says, yes, there are aliens visiting the earth, but that we have gained their technology and that a lot of the stuff we think is modern science is actually based on ET technology. And Joseph Blumrich, I added him because I interviewed him. He's interesting. Briefly, y'all may know about the book he wrote called The Spaceships of Ezekiel. I don't know if y'all have read that or not, but Blumrich was a NASA scientist, and he got to reading in the Bible about Ezekiel and about the craft he saw, the fiery wheel in the sky and blah, 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 and had the head of a lion and rotating wheels and all this stuff. And he said, well, I'm a NASA scientist. He said, I can disprove that. That's not a flying saucer. That's just mythology. But the more he studied it, the more he realized that it was a fairly accurate description of a landing craft. And he said he does not believe that it was an interplanetary spaceship or anything, but it was probably a shuttlecraft, to use the Star Trek vernacular. And so he, too, became a believer. Also good friends with Dave Hodges. I don't know if you follow him, but he's heavy into government conspiracies and all the stuff that's going on now. one of the key things about David is that his father worked for the government and worked in very classified programs and came into contact with a lot of the Paperclip Scientists. Everybody know who the Paperclip Scientists were? Yeah, okay, these were your Nazis that we brought over after the war under Project Paperclip, put them to work in our military-industrial complex, which, looking back now, at the time we thought this was a great thing because we were getting some ahead of the Russians in space technology because we had these Nazi rocket scientists that had already perfected the V1, the V2. But unfortunately, looking back, I think that we see now that when we took them into our military-industrial complex, we not only got their technology, but we also got their philosophy. And this is why National Socialism has reared its ugly head again. But of course, they can't call it National Socialism because everybody knows that the German acronym is Nazi. So we can't call them Nazis anymore. So the modern idiom is neocons, okay? They're National Socialists. But Dave had lots of interesting things to say about how that these Nazi scientists were all ahead in the space program. In fact, let me share this with you. There are actually 3 space programs. The Russians, whatever Nazi rocket scientists we got, they got what was left, or vice versa. So the Soviets had their rocket scientists, and they concentrated on heavy lift rockets. They could put big payloads up into space. And that's why that they were the first to put a satellite up, Sputnik. They were the first to put a dog into space, Laika. They were the first to put a woman in space. And here's an idea. No. No, so, but that's because they had the heavy lift. They could just put it up there. Oh, I'm getting myself in more trouble. All right, the United States, what we were doing, we were concentrating on the computerization and the guidance systems and all like that. Okay, well, you say, yeah, okay, but that's just the 2 space programs. No, there was a third one. There were people at the very top of the food chain and these Nazi scientists were in touch with each other. It's absolutely amazing, but when I researched Paperclip, I found out that most of them were stationed out at El Paso. And they were free to travel into Mexico every afternoon, every weekend, whenever they wanted to. And when they were in Mexico, they could send letters to Russia to their counterparts. And this was known, and this was allowed, because at the very top, at the level of the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Morgans, the people who really run the country, this is where they were putting the 2 together and creating a separate, secret space program. And it's really incredible. While we've been paying all our tax money and watching those heavy rockets take off from Cape Canaveral, blowing smoke and flame and everything else, they were developing anti-gravity. And they're over here in the Okefenokee swamp going, and they're just moving on out. And this is what I've gleaned from talking to people like this. And so we didn't actually beat the Nazis in World War II. In fact, if you go back and check, you'll find that when they signed the surrender at the Reims courthouse, that was the German army, or the German military, the Wehrmacht, as they call it. The Wehrmacht was the military. Within the Wehrmacht was the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, the Heer, the Army, okay? So the Army surrendered. The Nazis never surrendered. We just forced them to move. And they went to Argentina, they went to Egypt, and a lot of them came to the United States. I also was good friends with Bill Pollock, and he was a great guy. Some of you probably know his wife, Annie. She used to be a real staple as a worker at the International UFO Congress. But he was a former U.S. Air Force computer keyless entry specialist. And as such, he got to work on Area 51 and some of these really secretive places because he was installing these keyless locks, you know, where you have to put your hand on there, or you punch in a code, or you put your eye and, you know, they get the iris and all like that. So he saw lots of interesting stuff. One of the scariest stuff he ever told me was the fact that he worked for a company and the government ordered 2 billion chips to be implanted in somebody or something. And it'd be interesting to know whatever happened to those. I don't know, maybe we can come up with a machine, we could scan this audience and find out who has a chip. But working underground, working Area 51, Tonopah test range and stuff, he actually came into contact with some of the saucers that we have and mostly talked to a lot of people who knew about the existence of this. I also met Boyd Bushman, a very interesting old chap who worked for General Dynamics in Fort Worth. And in his later years, I think he got to that point where it's, I don't give a crap, you know? So he actually was talking about it all, talked about all the various types of aliens and the various types of ships. And the one thing that I'm pretty certain of, I know the number of how many alien species we're talking about varies from person to person. Some people say it's 3 and 4. Some people say it's 74. Some people say it's 102. I'm not sure anybody knows absolutely for sure. But I think it's safe to say that there is a living, bustling universe out there that we are basically unaware of. He also said that the Russians, along with the Chinese, are working with us at Area 51 researching anti-gravity. And I think what he meant by that is that we are back engineering these spacecraft that we have. I also met this interesting guy, Richard Tillman, who, as you can see, is a Navy lieutenant commander now. There's a lot of controversy now because they're trying to disown him and say that he's nuts and he never was anything. And yet, I know for a fact he's gotten into all kinds of top secret places. He's gone places that you and I couldn't go to. So this guy's for real. You may recall that back in 2008, there was a little bit of blurb in the media about the fact that there had been some meetings at the United Nations, and they were getting briefings on UFOs. And basically, they were meeting with some of the leaders of other countries, and primarily their public relations people, and telling them they better get their populations prepared for disclosure for the fact that there are aliens here, there are visiting the Earth. Some of y'all may recall those stories. Richard Tillman was one of these briefers. He was there. He has some incredible stories. I met him in New York. He told me that at one point they had worked on him, had opened his chest and had done some kind of work so that he could breathe the atmosphere on Venus, and they sent him to Venus, and he was there for a while with other alien species, not from Venus. There was a base there that he went to, and he opened his shirt, and sure enough, he had a big scar that went from the bottom of his throat way down past his navel. It was kind of extraordinary to me because as a police reporter, I've sat in on autopsies, and an autopsy is about the only thing I've ever seen that has a scar like that. So I don't know what to tell you other than he seemed quite sincere in what he's saying. Also, confirming the United Nations meetings was this Frenchman, Gilles Laurent, who he went back and wrote about it and said, yes, he had been at the meeting, and he said that the UK ambassador, Sir John Sawyers, and Vatican Archbishop Celestino Meligori were also among 28 representatives there. It was noted at theirs that the U.S. government has been given a timetable for disclosure by the ETs and to prepare people for open contact by 2017. Whoa, only 1 year away. All right, I hope we're ready. I will also, let me add this real quick. Back in the early 1950s when the flying saucer thing got started and the government was asking itself, should we tell people the truth? You know, should we reveal the fact that we're being visited? And two things worked against that. One was the fact that if you'll stop and think about it, the basic purpose of government is to provide for the common defense. Defense, okay? In fact, in the Constitution, it only gives the government basically two powers. One is to coin and regulate money, which we gave that away in 1913, and turned it over to the private Federal Reserve System, which was a huge mistake. We're now paying for it. And the second thing in the Constitution was to provide for the common defense. Well, so since providing for the defense is the basic foundation of government, they couldn't very well say coming off of World War II, a big war, and going into the Cold War, they couldn't very well say, well, these things are flying through our atmosphere, and not only are we not sure who they are, but we can't stop them. So that pretty well, you know, destroys the whole rationale for paying our taxes for a big government. So that's number one. They couldn't admit to that. Number two, they did a study through the, well, I think it was the Brookings Institution, and they said, what happens when a more advanced civilization comes into direct contact with a less advanced civilization? Well, of course, all they had to go by was Earth history. So they went back and they looked when the British went in and fought the Fuzzy Wuzzies, or then the settlers came and fought the North American natives, the Indians. And sure enough, they came back and said, well, in every instance when a more advanced civilization comes in direct contact with a more primitive civilization, the more primitive one is either destroyed or just assimilated, but basically it goes away. So at that point, they said, I guess maybe we better not tell people what's really going on. And they were, at that time, and maybe rightly so, concerned that there would be public panic and that there would be disruption in government and in religion. And there is some support for that, because some of the older people may recall that back in the late 30s, I think it was 1938, when Orson Welles did his War of the Worlds radio program, okay? That was an innocuous thing. It was on Halloween night, and he came on and said, this is the Fireside Theater, and we're gonna do a adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and we hope you enjoy this. And then they went on, they'd play some music, and they'd say, we interrupt this broadcast to bring you this news bulletin. These cylinders have fallen in New Jersey, and then they'd play music, and then they'd come back and say, oh, the cylinders are open up, and these things are coming out, they're building these machines, and then they'd come back and go, oh, we interrupt with this breaking news. These machines are blasting cities and killing people, and you know, well, people who turned in a little late, you know, all they heard was the, oh my God. And it did. It caused a lot of public panic. But now, folks, think about it. Number one, that was 1938. Back then, polls showed, in fact, well into the 1950s, that most people did not believe there was any kind of life outside the Earth. I remember in the late 40s, early 50s, I was an avid reader, so I was already reading, well, I'd already read all the so-called classic books like Ivanhoe and Black Beauty, Tale of Two Cities, you name it. I'd already gone through all that, so I was into science fiction, which, by the way, at that early point was not even a genre. They hadn't even called it science fiction back in the early 50s. That didn't come along until a little later. But I was reading Ray Bradbury and Robert Heinlein and all those folks. And I was really into it. So I told my Southern Baptist mother, I said, man, we're going to go into space and we're going to launch satellites and we're going to go to the moon. And she said, quit filling your head with that nonsense. You know, she said, there's nothing outside the Earth. And that wasn't just my mother. That was the prevalent attitude of most people at that time. I'll never forget that afternoon in the fall of 1957 when I came home from school and picked up the newspaper and the headline said, Russians launched satellite, Sputnik, you know. I went in there and I showed that to my mom. I said, look, this is what I've been talking about. And her eyes got that big and she never said another word about me reading science fiction. So, you know, it actually works. Also, Vance Davis, you may recall him. He was one of the 6 AWOL soldiers that went AWOL from Europe, came over here and said, they're here, you know, we need to tell the world about it. So It's not like there's not people who have been trying to tell us about this all along. Here's what's interesting too. This is Army General Keith Alexander. While he was head of the Intelligence Security Command, he set up his Information Dominance Center to look like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. Who said generals don't have perks? I'm just wondering if he had a Lieutenant Uhura. So, remote viewing aliens. All right, since most of us have not had a direct face-to-face with aliens, and all we can do is read books and listen to people who tell us their adventures, and then we're all, wondering who you're going to believe and how's it work. Well, I discovered remote viewing. Back in the late 70s, there was a book came out called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. Some of you probably still remember that. And basically, it told that the Soviets, after World War II, had not only taken the German rocket scientists, but they'd taken their mind control experts and their psychic people and had worked with them and had been developing psychic ability. And psychic ability, we used to call it clairvoyance. Now we call it remote viewing. The Russians call it extrasensors. But basically it's the same thing. You sit quietly, you clear your mind, you go into a meditative state, and you throw your mind out somewhere else, and you pick up sensations and sometimes visualizations. Now if you sit down, close your eyes, and picture a South Sea island with the palm trees and the waves lapping and the little grass hut and the birds, seagulls flying by, that's daydreaming. That's not remote viewing, okay? This is why in remote viewing they have to be very careful when they give you a target. If I set you people down and say, okay, we're going to do some remote viewing, and I just flat tell you I want you to remote view the Eiffel Tower, well, then you can sit down, close your eyes, bingo, you got a picture of the Eiffel Tower because you've either been there or you've seen pictures of it. You know exactly what it looks like. That's not remote viewing. So in remote viewing, what I'd have to do is I come up with what they call a coordinate. And it actually started as a coordinate. They'd actually get a longitude and latitude degree coordinate, give them that coordinate, and then their mind would go there, and they were able to study it, because if I gave you the coordinates of the North Pole, for example, and you say, well, okay, I'm there, and it's cold, and it's white, and I see a bear, but he's all white. Well, then, wow, polar bear, North Pole, so you know you're there. But pretty soon they realized you don't even really have to have a real coordinate. So now the coordinate number is simply a number that represents the target. Now, how all this works, nobody's absolutely sure. It's a very strange thing, and it's very metaphysical. Some of you are into this, and some of you are not. My particular understanding is that everything in the whole universe, including this podium, is nothing but energy. It's just atoms. It's all made up of atoms, and they're all jammed together. But if you know anything about science, you know that an atom is 98% empty space. So this thing is basically empty space, but doesn't feel like it. In fact, if I bang my head on it, it's probably going to hurt. So that's because we perceive things and we operate on a 3D material level, and yet everything in the universe is energy. When you have a thought, and you've heard the term thought form, when you have a thought form, that's energy, and it just goes out into the energy grid. And this is why we have all kinds of weird things, like you may be working around and you suddenly think, hey, I think my best friend's going to call me. And in about 10 minutes, the phone rings, it's your best friend. This is how we subconsciously pick up on this stuff. Now, some people do it a lot better than others, a lot more naturally. Others have to really work at it. But when they did the research for the Army's remote viewing programs, they found out some interesting things. They found out that every single person has this ability, okay? But now, let me tell you, that's like saying every one of you has the ability to play Chopin on the piano. Yes, you do. But most of you could probably do it a whole lot better than me, because I don't play the piano. But think about it. If you'd take piano lessons And then you'd practice day after day after day. Pretty soon, you could play Chopin on the piano. So it's the same thing with the remote viewing. You think you can't do it, but actually, if you really worked at it, some more easily than others, you could actually pretty much get to where you could do some remote viewing. And this is why that they began to study it at SRI. They did these original studies, like this is a airport in Colombia that was one of their early targets. And then so the guy drew this little diagram, and you can see that it's very comparable to the target. Interestingly enough, the Army picked up on this, and at one time actually had a unit of about 25 people that weren't doing nothing but doing remote viewing. But the Army didn't, at the top, the old generals, they didn't think much of this, so they had them headquartered in these little wooden buildings at Fort Meade that during World War II had been bakery school. So they're in these little ramshackle things, but they'd come in, sit in chairs or lounge around and meditate, and then they go do the remote viewing. But oddly enough, it really worked, and they really got some success out of it, and so it continued. This is a chronology of kind of how it all began. If you get interested, if you really want the details, in my book, Sci-Spies, PSI Spies, is the history of remote viewing, how it started, how it worked, and it was, some of it's just really fascinating. Y'all remember the Warner Brothers cartoon where the wolf and the sheepdog go to work, and they say, "Hey, Ed, hey, Fred," and they clock in, and then they chase each other around trying to protect the sheep. That kind of reminds me of what the remote viewers told me about when they began to encounter their Soviet counterparts. They would go to some particular defense establishment somewhere in the Ural Mountains or maybe somewhere else, maybe go somewhere in China, and all of a sudden they'd be aware that these Soviets or these Russian extrasensors, they're there too. And Dave Morehouse, I believe it was, because he was a self-professed fighter, warrior, soldier, he said the first time that he was there and he realized his opposite numbers was there, he goes into his fighting stance because he thinks, oh my God, there's the enemy. But then they realize that they're not physically there. So they can't really do anything to each other anyway. So after a time, it was like, hey, Ivan, hey, Joe. They just kind of pass in the ether, so to speak. I always thought that was interesting. There's so many interesting tales about it. Lynn Buchanan, who was the training officer for the remote viewing unit, one time told me that they wanted him to go and view a particle beam weapon that the Soviets were developing. And he went and looked at this thing, and it was some weird machine, and it's spewing this energy stream, So he knew that his superiors were going to know, well, now how does this work? What exactly does this do? So he said he placed himself, mentally of course, he placed himself in this beam, and he said it was really weird, he said, because suddenly it was like he'd been split into a million pieces. There was just a stream of himself, and they were all aware of each other. They knew that they were there. And this is beginning to get to the basics of who we are, where we are, and how we fit into this universe. We're all bits of energy. And he saw himself as these bits of energy when he got in the particle beam. And then when he stepped out of it mentally, he was all back together again, okay? It's really amazing. My idea is, and please just accept this as my understanding, which I'm just a poor old journalist. I may not understand everything that well, but we're kind of like your computer. In your computer, there's just little sparks of energy called bytes, right? And individually, they're not much, but when you put 1 million bytes together, you get artificial intelligence. And your computer can compute, it can add, subtract, do things, and the more bytes you get together, the smarter your computer can be. Well, I think we all are bytes. We all are individual sparks of energy, and we're all different, but yet when we combine, then all that energy together forms a sentient, self-aware being that encompasses the entire universe, is omnipresent, omnipotent, pretty well fits the definition of God. So that's when people say, well, I'm part of God. That sounds kind of pretentious, but in a way, that's true, because I think we all are. And once you begin to understand that, then you can start taking control of your life and start following your intuition and start getting along better with everybody around you, because we're all in this together, right? So that was remote viewing. It went through several changes. They called it Grill Flame, Center Lane, Eagle Claw, Dragoon, Absorb, Sunstreak, Stargate. They never ever were officially tasked to go look at UFOs, because according to the brass, UFOs didn't exist. So they certainly weren't going to task them to go look at something that didn't exist. But every single one of the remote viewers that was trained by the military that I've talked to, every single one of them had direct knowledge of the UFOs. Now, some of them won't talk about it at all. Some of them will kind of talk about it, but they hedge, and they'll say, well, I had some anomalous viewings, and we all know what anomalies are, right? That's the WTF of science. But others then would actually talk about it quite openly. And so now this is what I'm going to show you about. The ones who would really talk about it, let's see what they saw. Some of the ones that I had direct contact with and impressed me as being some of the best viewers. Lynn Buchanan, Ingo Swann, he was a fabulous person, and one of the chief engine scientists that worked with it and helped develop the protocols for doing remote viewing. Joe McMonagle, one of the earlier ones. Mel Riley, just a good old boy, but he turned out to be a great natural remote viewer. Skip Atwater, who was their commanding officer for a while. Paul Smith and David Morehouse. And then I've already discussed the war and the after, how that the extrasensors and our remote viewers would come about. Now, here's something they told me about, and then I found, strangely enough, I think I found some corroboration for it, was several of them said that they saw what they call buckyballs, and that's named after Buckminster Fuller, because he did these geodesic houses and stuff. So these things are multifaceted little objects, and they're not very big. In fact, if I remember correctly, they said they're only about the size of a hand grenade, but they see them in orbit. They see them up there, and they say that basically we're quarantined, okay? And I think this explains why that we reportedly went to the moon 6 times, and yet we never went back. And yet I remember that before the Apollo 11 mission, the whole idea was we were going to go to the moon, we were going to colonize the moon, we were going to mine the moon for minerals, and it was going to pay for the space program. But none of that ever happened. We're told we went there 6 times, and then they said, well, yeah, but it's a dead world, nothing there. It's too expensive, we can't go back. And yet, at the time that they stopped the Apollo missions, they had 22 of those Atlas rockets still ready to go. Now and they said, well, yeah, but it cost a lot of money. And that never sat well with me, because that's like saying, hey, we just built from scratch a Rolls Royce. But we can't afford the gasoline, so we can't drive it around anywhere. It's just stupid. There's something else going on, and I think we were quarantined. I think somebody told us, hey, you keep your atomic weapons and your hatred and your tribal factions to yourself. You just keep that right on the earth and don't be bringing it out here. And so as a result, they said they saw these buckyballs in orbit. And they said that when there was a space shot and they're going to put up a communication satellite, or maybe a deep space probe for science, they'd go up, they'd take off, they'd do their thing. They said, but on some of these missions where, and I remember working for the newspaper, every now and then there'd be a story that says, there's going to be a launch next Wednesday, but it's classified. This is military and there's not any news about it. Okay, well, they'd try to launch one of those things, and the next thing you know, you'd see a story very briefly way down here somewhere. They lost contact, oops. That one didn't work. The remote viewers said that's because the buckyballs would take them out. They'd drop out of orbit and they'd strike these things, and then they'd blow up or disintegrate. That'd be the end of that. I think it's part of the quarantine. Now, is there any proof that that ever happened? Well, this goes back to 93 Space News, which is not a tabloid rag. This is space industry. They talked about a Titan IV that blew up after takeoff. And it said that of course, the official story was that the explosion of the Titan IV rocket on August the 2nd appears to be linked to a solid rocket motor segment that was repaired several years ago. It says, but in a strange twist, Colonel Sterling said he'd been told that the Air Force video of the launch shows an unidentified object apparently striking the Titan at an altitude of 110,000 feet shortly before the rocket blew up. Was that a buckyball? We don't know, because they don't tell us these things. But we also, to bring it up a little closer, we also know about the meteor that exploded over Russia in 2013. And if that thing had hit, it would have been a major disaster. But instead, as you can see, it blew up in the atmosphere and just scattered little pieces. And so it hit the news briefly and then went away. And yet, at the films of it, there's some object that seems to fly into it and take it out. So are we being protected by our own governments, or are we being protected by them? So there's a lot of stuff that we're not being told about. Of course, it all goes back to one of the best psychics was Pat Price. He early on showed up for work one day when they were testing remote viewing at Stanford Research Institute, and says, you know, I was doing some remote viewing at home and I found that there are 4 alien bases on the Earth. He said one of them is they're all under mountains. So one is under Mount Perdido in the Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and France. The other is under Mount Inyagani in Zimbabwe. Another is under Mount Zeal in Australia and Mount Hayes in Alaska. Well, everybody just went, huh. But they filed that away, and then some years later, when they had formed the remote viewing unit and Skip Atwater was in charge of their training, he was told, why don't you give them some kind of really strange target, you know? Well, he remembered Pat Price's earlier remote viewing, so he dug out the files and he targeted the remote viewers. He said, you know, gave them a coordinate which represented, are there alien bases on the Earth? And sure enough, they come back and they found all 4 of them. It's interesting because, as I recall, the one in Alaska is like a weather station. It's observing and recording what the environment of the Earth is doing, okay? The one in Australia is kind of an R&R, Rest and Recreation Center. And they said there you find different types of aliens and humans, and they're kind of like, I don't know, kind of like a shopping mall or something. The one in Africa is a repair center. That's where you go if your craft needs repair. And so they verified and came up with the same thing Pat Price had come up with, which I think lends a lot of credibility to the whole story. Then we get to the Mars Observer. If you remember, in August of 1995, we sent the Mars Observer up and we made a big deal about it because it was actually going to orbit Mars and then was going to land, and we were going to get all of this first-hand information about Mars. But as it went into orbit around Mars, oops, well, we lost it. Well, what happened to it? And of course, at that time, I was busy working with these remote viewers. So I called up several of them and I said, okay, what happened to the Mars Observer? And they said, well, what happened to it was the same thing that happened to the Soviet Phobos 2. I said, well, what was that? So they said, well, the Phobos 2, the Russians sent it up, and as it approached Mars and was about to go into orbit, said a circular-shaped object rose from the surface of Mars, came out to meet it, and then beamed it with some sort of electromagnetic beam And they said, but this was not a hostile act. They just went up to see what it was, and they beamed it. In fact, one of them compared it to the tugboats going out to meet the Queen Mary, okay? So they went out to usher it in, and then beamed it, and then found out it wasn't theirs. So they just turned around and went back to the surface of Mars. But when they beamed it with this electromagnetic energy, it messed up the onboard computers, and the computers failed. They lost control over it, and it spiraled into the atmosphere of Mars and burned up. And that's what they said what happened to the Phobos 2. And they said same thing happened to the Mars Observer. Well, again, is there any feedback? Is there any way of determining if this is true or not? And here you can see the object that one of the remote viewers drew. And it's kind of circular, but it's also kind of oddly shaped. Well, interestingly enough, Marina Popovich was a Soviet cosmonaut, and she came to the United States to visit. And in California, she did an interview, and she held up one of the last photographs taken by the Phobos 2 before they lost contact with it. And as you can see, the little object that was approaching the Phobos 2 looks very similar to the object that the remote viewers drew. So again, we have material confirmation and credibility to show that these viewings are correct. Lightly, I'll touch on the UFO crash at Aztec, New Mexico. I don't know how much y'all know about that, but it happened up near the Four Corners. The way they got away with this one even better than they did at Roswell was because instead of sending troops from New Mexico up to Aztec to recover the craft, which they would have been seen and people would have reported that, they sent troops down from Colorado, which is just a little bit across the border. They came down, grabbed everything, went back, and that's why even today you can go talk to people around Aztec and they go, no, I don't think any of that happened. I never saw any of that. But yet it was covered quite extensively in Frank Scully's magazine. And I know at some point here you can see Linda Howe and myself and you know, a bunch of the researchers, including Stanton Freeman, and we all went out there and we all looked at this, and sure enough, there is evidence that this went on. They did a controlled remote viewing session that was commissioned by the Aztec Library Association. And this controlled remote viewing is what Lynn Buchanan does. And what they found out was that this object had landed. There were things there. They were actually able to obtain what they called biologicals. We call them aliens. And what's really sad is that they were not all dead. So they sent people in protective clothing, and there was an attempt at negotiation amongst the parties involved, but they couldn't understand them. And so at the end of it, they officially were executed. Welcome to Earth. And people wonder why they don't just land and say, you know, here we are, we come in peace. Well, I'll give you another example. In the Dallas Morning News, that speaking of the Aurora spaceship crash of 1897, and of course there's a lot of controversy about that. They say, oh, that never happened. Well, yes, it did. And one of the proofs of that is on the April the 19th, 1897 front page of the Dallas Morning News, there are 16 stories, and they come from correspondents as far north as Oklahoma, as far south as almost Austin, Texas. Every single one of the stories is talking about the silver cigar-shaped object flying around through the skies of North Texas 6 years before the Wright brothers flew. There was nothing man-made in the air. But one of the best stories comes from Granbury, Texas. And it said about 9:30 last night, the Riddle Rifles were drilling, and the leader is a populist, a warsome young man. He could not stand the sight of the air machine, so he ordered the company to open fire, and they did, and soon the whole town was aroused. What is it, Joe Bob? I don't know, shoot at it. There you go. Now you know why they don't just land and say, hey, we'll be friends. What they did do on the remote viewing of Aztec showed that they were taken to a government building, and one of them said, it's one of those government buildings you hope you never go to because you may not get out alive. And then they began to draw some of the UFOs that they had seen. Ingo Swann, I know one time, was tasked to go and observe a Soviet submarine. And he was sitting there with a bunch of military officers, and he starts describing this circular object, and it just passed behind a cloud. And they, wait a minute, they said, are you talking about the submarine? He said, oh, no, I'm talking about this thing that's over the submarine. They said, well, we told you to look at the submarine. He said, yeah, but who wants to look at a submarine when you see a flying saucer up there, you know? So he was describing the flying saucer. So these are some of the drawings that the remote viewers did on the different types of saucers they saw. And these are NASA photographs of, this is the moon, and this is a good shot of the moon with a saucer. So we know they're up there. In fact, one of the remote viewers said, you know, it looks like there's a parking lot around the Earth. There's so many craft up there. So, of course, there's different races. They finally said, all of them, they were not tasked to go look at UFOs, but nevertheless, they'd all do it. I mean, they'd tell them to go up in the upper atmosphere, take a look, see if they could see any high-performance aircraft up there. So they go look, and as Dave Morehouse once told me, he said, I went up there and looked at this craft. He said, those guys were not from the neighborhood. So they were not even from here. So at one point, a few of them got to talking. They said, well, look, you know, you see them, I see them, we know. Where are they coming from? Is there some unity to all of this? Is there a command center? Is there something, for want of a better expression, the galactic headquarters? So they tasked Mel Riley to go take a look at Galactic Federation headquarters. And he came up with this drawing of a beautiful lake in a high mountainous area. He said it was, his analogy was Lake Titicaca, and that there was a big flat plateau there. And on this plateau was a pyramid with a ramp and an opening in this mountainous area above this lake. And he says, I find myself moving up an inclined causeway with rough stone walls on both sides. At the end of the causeway is a long, dimly lit rectangular corridor constructed of smooth dressed stone on all sides. He said, this is an entrance to a beautiful white pyramid type structure on a rocky-like promontory with, interestingly enough, these two obelisks on either side. As he went in, he said he had a feeling that this was a familiar place. He felt warm and accepted, and like he was almost like, I'm home. And he said there was a stone dais or altar here, and he just strolled in and laid down on it mentally. And he said there were these hooded beings around him, but the whole thing was a pleasant experience. He felt like that he was they were kind of inspecting him just like he was expecting them. And he said, at the end of this inclined corridor is a long room with a very high vaulted ceiling. There's a large polished stone platform in this room like an altar, white-robed entities in a semicircular to one side. Their attention seems to be focused on the platform. The room is dimly lit. There's a feeling of something sacred, almost holy, religious about this place. He said, it seems familiar, as if I'd been here before. I climb onto the platform and lie down. I was then illuminated by a brilliant shaft of white light from head to toe. The light was coming from overhead. A robed figure then moved from behind the group and stood next to me and put a hand out and stretched over my solar plexus. And at that point, he kind of woke up and came back. Now, interestingly enough, other remote viewers were also asked to go look at galactic headquarters, if you will. And this was the drawing that one of them made, and here's a little drawing that a separate one made, and yet you can see the details are very, very similar. And the one that really got me was when they were drawing, well, here again we can see a more detailed drawing of what they saw. And again, these are separate viewers, and yet they obviously are drawing the same location, wherever that is. But I really like the drawings who see this city on another world, and it's in a kind of a bowl, and there's living quarters along the sides. There's a water tank, I guess, a cistern here. They got a tall tower, and it's exactly the same thing that another viewer sees with the water cistern and the houses along the side. There's a pyramid, and this one didn't mention the pyramid, but he started to draw it. So here's the pyramid, and then the tower. It's all there. So see, once you really look at it, remote viewing may be our best opportunity to actually find out what's out there. Because why should we spend millions and billions of dollars on these heavy spacecraft, you know, polluting the air and shooting people through the air and trying to go out, taking light years, 100 years just to go somewhere, when we can all go out there in our minds? And this is what one of the viewers sketched as what he saw. It kind of looks familiar, looks kind of like the Greys, but with clothes on. And quickly, anybody got the time? How much time have I got left? Half an hour, great. I got time to tell you the wildest story yet. What could be stranger than a space alien? A space alien ghost. And I wrote, hey, I'm an old newspaper guy. I don't fall for just anything and everything. And if you told me I got a story about an alien ghost, I would probably have given you the raspberries. But this happened to me, and I happen to know it's true, and I'm going to share this with you all. Okay, we all know the Roswell story. In fact, I sat in on Linda Howe. She gave us quite a good detailed description. So you know that in July the 4th, an object crashed north of Roswell. Army units cordoned off the thing and cleaned up the debris field. And then according to the accounts, they took these dead aliens, or at least dying aliens, to the base hospital of the 509th Army Airfield Hospital there on the south end of Roswell. This is what it looked like at the time. It was kind of just one of these frame buildings, and that's where the local mortician, Dennis David, said he got a call from the medical officer at the base, wanted to know if they had 5 child-sized coffins. A little later, he got another call asking if he knew how to preserve bodies that had been out in the open for a while. So we know that they were trying to deal with these aliens. Within a few years, this is interesting. This happened July the 4th, 1947. Within a few months, in September 1947, suddenly they rushed through the National Security Act of 1947. In fact, it's my understanding that President Truman at the time, his mother had passed away. He was trying to get out of Washington so he could go home and be at the funeral of his own mother, and they held him at National Airport for several hours because they wanted to rush out and get him to sign into law this National Security Act of 1947. Well, what the National Security Act did was create the CIA, separate the Army Air Corps into the Air Force, separate it from the Army. And what a little known other fact that nobody much pays attention to, but was very far reaching, was it created the National Security Council. Now, if you'll stop and think about it, you always hear these stories about, well, we invaded Panama and we invaded this country and it was given okay by the National Security Council. Well, that sounds like there's a council of learned, wise people, you know, who are looking after our best interests. But officially, the National Security Council is the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State. 3 of these are appointed by the President. This is when we kind of lost the Republic. This is when we went. Now everything the president says goes, okay, but they can lay it off on the National Security Council and on whoever they designate to bring in to, you know, they bring in a general or anybody who might can give them information. But those 4 people, that's the National Security Council. So isn't that interesting? This is rushed into law right after the Roswell incident so they could gain control over the UFO issue. Before long, the Roswell Army Airfield was pretty much done away with, and they built Walker Air Force Base. This was the Walker Air Force Base Hospital. It was built in the early 50s. And back in 2009 or whenever it was, I was out there on a totally separate photo shoot. And we needed a hospital that looked like a hospital from back in the 50s or 60s. And we found it in the New Mexico Rehabilitation Center, which had been the base hospital for Walker Air Force Base, but then they had abandoned that in the late 60s, and the state of New Mexico picked it up and was using it as a rehabilitation hospital for indigent people, okay? Doing great work out there. So I'm meeting with the assistant director, and I said, we're wanting to shoot in your hospital because it was perfect for our purposes. It had checkerboard tile floors and rails and little eggshell lights, and it looked like an old hospital. So she was great. Back before Roswell got big time, it was just a little town, and everybody, like in most small towns, were very friendly and cooperative. She said, yeah, you can come shoot. Says, in fact, you can go up on the this wing up here and shoot on the second floor. Said, just, you know, do whatever you want to up there. Said we use that mostly for storage. And if she had left it at that, I would have thought, okay. But she said the staff doesn't like to go up there. Oh. Being a good journalist, I said, well, why? And she says, well, they think it's haunted. Oh, okay. This was nothing new to me, because any of you who have had experiences around hospitals know that almost every hospital, because let's face it, that's where people go and die. And so almost every hospital will have a ghost story or two attached to it. So that wasn't any big deal. But I thought that was interesting. So as the camera crew went about their business, production crew, I talked to the telephone operator, who was an elderly lady. And she said she had taken over the job from her mother, who had been there ever since the hospital was Walker Air Force Hospital way back in the early 50s. I said, did you ever hear about the haunting? Oh, yeah, we all know about the ghost. You know, and so her mother had told her about the ghost. So the story goes back at least to the early 50s. And so then I talked to some of the maintenance people, and they're going, yeah, it's kind of strange. Says, if we stay, you know, if we're here overnight, said lights go off and on up there, and we hear footsteps, and the elevators go up and down, and we go up there, and there's nobody there. So I'm going, that's a pretty interesting story. Got a nice ghost story here going on in the hospital. So finally I located Nurse Josie Maroney's. And they said, well, she'll be at work tomorrow night. So the next night I went back, talked to her, and she said, it was shocking. It happened twice. So the first time I saw it, I didn't tell anybody because I figured they'd think I was crazy. But after I saw it the second time, I realized this is real. I saw this figure no more than 5 foot tall, great big head, big dark eyes, and hands that had no fingers, kind of like mittens. And it was wrapped in kind of a shiny cloth. It was definitely not human. So I'm going, wait a minute, a ghost, and it's short, it's got big eyes, it's in Roswell? Sounds like an alien ghost. I said, that couldn't be. And so here, though, is what it looks like. That's one of the hallways. And while I was there, by the way, seeing this metal cabinet over here that's like a medicine cabinet, I was there with some people doing the shoot, and it had a couple of psychics that were with them. And we were all standing up there one night, and both of these ladies, these psychics, said, well, he's here now. And I look all around, I don't see anything. I said, well, where is he? And they pointed to one of these metal cabinets built into the wall like that, and they said, he's standing right in the middle of that. Well, of course, I didn't see anything. But we had another guy there who had some kind of Gauss meter, or anyway, it registers energy. And so he went running over there, and he starts moving it down this thing, and it went beep, 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 right exactly where the psychic said this being was standing. So my jaw dropped a little bit. But then comes the clincher. We got a satellite photograph, and we overlaid the map of the old Roswell Army Airfield with the new Walker Air Force and this rehabilitation center, and this exact location of where this hallway is that they said was the alien ghost is exactly where the operating room was in the original Roswell Army Air Force Hospital. So, alien ghost, sure sounds like it. And if you want more information, I think I've sold out of sci-spies, but I've still got some our occultal history, and I think I still have some alien agendas. And that's the story of remote viewing aliens, and they're here, and we all know about it, but we just got to wait for everybody else to catch up. And I appreciate the chance of talking with you, and I don't know if we're set up for questions, but I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have. Thank you. You may have seen me on Ancient Astronauts, so as you know, that's another interest of mine. A book, Our Occulted History, I worked with, my premise was, you know, if there were ancient astronauts on this planet, did they all leave? Or are some of them still here? And if they're still here, then who are they and where are they and what are they up to? That's what I try to answer in Our Occulted History. And I use the term occulted. Don't worry, you're not going to have to read about Satan worship or vampires or, you know, this. It's not the occult. It's the astronomical sense of the word. When the moon, you have blocks the sun, you have an eclipse, that's called an occultation. The moon occults the sun, which means it hides it or masks it. So our occulted history simply means our hidden history, the history that you have not been told about. Are you ready? Or you can...
Yes, just tell me if people want to... Is this live?
Stroke it.
It's on. Okay, there we go. If you have questions for Jim, come up and line up right here, and I'll work the mic for you.
Great.
All right.
Since this is about remote viewing, sir, I got one name for you. Major Ed Daines.
Well, since I make it a point not to badmouth people, he asked me about Ed Daines, and I am not going to get into all that, but I will say this. He violates his own methodology. Ed Daines himself told me, one person cannot sit down in a chair, have one remote viewing session, and accurately tell, about anything. But yet that's what he does.
Hi, Jim.
Hi.
I saw you in the Del Rio, I think. I met you for the first time. Anyway, did you look over that affidavit of Jerome C. Nelson, who was at Roswell in the winter of '63 and '64, that testified before the UFO nuke press conference in Washington that Roswell was invaded 6 to 10 times during that winter? Did you look over that piece of document that I gave you?
I'll have to be honest and say I'm not really familiar with what you're talking about.
I've got a copy. I'll make sure you get one.
Yeah, please do that.
Yeah.
I'd be quite interested.
Because as far as I'm concerned, like they said, nothing ever happened. Well, we got a commander of nuclear missiles in Roswell in '63 and '64 that says the base was invaded.
Interesting. Of course, we do know that, everywhere there's been nuclear missiles and weapons, that there's been UFO flyovers. In fact, there have been instances of where apparently they have been interfering with the launch codes. And I know I talked with that with Colonel Corso. And in fact, I said, Colonel Corso, the tone of your book seems to be that these aliens are our enemies and they're hostile. I said, what makes you think that? And being the old Cold Warrior and World War II vet that he was, he said, well, they'd fly over our installations, we'd order them to stop, and they wouldn't stop. I went, okay. But I can't help shake the idea that perhaps they messed with the nuclear launch codes and they maybe have saved us from blowing ourselves up, Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, you know, nowadays they're talking with all the ancient aliens and all of this. Now the new thing is that they're trying to tell people if you pray, you can stop an abduction. And I just figured, you know, you've talked to hundreds of people and written about all kinds of stories. What's your take on this?
Well, I at least would like to think that we're still autonomous spiritual people. Okay, I don't feel like anybody is forcing me to do things. Now, you know, we're all susceptible to TV and programming and everything else. And like, if I knew everything there is to know psychologically about you, and I know you really crave ice cream, then I could probably pretty accurately predict that what's going to happen if I offer you some ice cream. Okay, so yeah, there are certain things we can do it, but I like to think that we are all individuals. And if we will simply get hold of ourselves and be in control of ourselves, that we can fight off some of this being. I know I had an experience one time when very unusual, because it hardly ever happens to me. I never get depressed, and I never get particularly unhappy. I've just been a very fortunate guy. But all of a sudden one night, I just got these feelings of dread and paranoia and. You know, and I was feeling kind of bad and down, and then suddenly in the back of my mind I thought, this is not me. This is not the way I usually think about this. I said, I think maybe somebody's messing with me. And I said, well, I don't know if they are or not, but hey, to hell with you, I ain't doing this. And it all stopped. Yeah. Yeah. And another thing, I think one of the best weapons we have is humor. Okay? Humor. Because because if aliens are trying to deal with you, they basically don't understand humor. And we humans have some very strange humor. One of my favorite stories is about a British officer during the Korean War, and the runners come into him and they said, sir, the Chinese have gotten in our rear. And he said, they're on our right flank and they're on our left flank, and of course they're in front of us, you know. And he said, well, they shan't get away from us this time. That, you know, see, I gotta laugh. Aliens don't understand that. I give another quick example. As a police reporter, I once had a story about a woman that called in to report a flasher. And it just happened to be close by, and I had a mobile unit, and I swung over there to see what was happening. And I still laugh thinking about it. She lived on the second floor of an apartment complex. So she'd gotten off work, and she'd climbed the stairs and was approaching her door when this guy comes up behind her. And he drops his trousers, you know, he's going to flash her. Well, she was shocked, but in her shock, she just started laughing. And the guy was so bamboozled, because let's face it, flashers and stuff, they want to get that feeling of power, like, you know, they got something over you. Well, she's laughing at him. So he turned and tried to run off, and he tripped over his trousers, and he fell down both flights of stairs. And when the cops showed up, he's still lying there about half conscious, you know. And they just pick him up and haul him off. Anyway, I just thought that was really, really funny. And there again, you know, it's maybe when you're the most scared, start laughing. No telling what it's going to do. Yes, ma'am.
First, a comment. First of all, I've been listening to you, reading your things for more decades than probably either of us care to admit. And my question is, and you look amazing, by the way.
No. Okay. We're all getting long in the tooth.
Just say thank you, all right? Okay. So anyway, my question is this. I've noticed over the decades that your areas of interest have varied greitly from you've been all over the galaxy, right? Okay, and I've been right there with you.
I think I invented the word eclectic.
My question is this. Did you ever consider writing a book about the journey from one topic to another, and maybe how they all tie in together now?
That's an interesting question, and actually I've kind of thought about that, but not very seriously. And I guess the main reason is because I at least like to consider myself an old Southern gentleman, and I don't really feel very comfortable about talking about myself. because as a journalist, it's always been about the material, not about me. But as you can tell by my story about the alien ghost and a bunch of stuff, I guess actually I have been very fortunate. I mean, I've been a poor reporter. And when I say poor reporter, I mean reporters, they get paid about like school teachers, okay? And in fact, it's always been amazing to me that to me, some of the most important people in our society, school teachers, police officers, okay? Yeah, well, my wife was a teacher for 40 years, so I'm very familiar with that. Teachers, police officers, reporters, very important, and they're the lowest paid of anybody. You know, that's not right. But anyway, I've been very fortunate because as a reporter, though, I get to go and report on things. So I get to go to Europe, Tibet, South America, Canada, you know, been all around, and yet I've never really had any money to speak of. So I just feel very, very fortunate, and I don't know, you may have a good suggestion. Maybe one of these days I ought to write down all of my travels and all of my adventures. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Mr. Mars, we're all fortunate that you're here speaking with us today.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Quick question about the remote viewing. How about remote viewing of the possible German bases in the Antarctic? Also remote viewing about our interaction with aliens and underground bases. What do you know of that?
Well, she's asking about remote viewing of alien bases and of the possible German base, Agartha, down in Antarctica. I think that's great, and I think it ought to be done, and something tells me it may have been done, but I'm not aware of those specific things or what they found out. But I will tell you this, any of you that listen to Jeff Rense on the Rense Network, that's just Google R-E-N-S-E. Over the past couple of months, this has been really amazing because of my work and knowledge in the Kennedy assassination. I know there has been at least 5 remote viewings of the Kennedy assassination, okay, including the recent ones that they've done by Dick Allgaier and Daz Smith, and then they came on Jeff Rense's program and reported their findings. He had me on there to maybe explain what they were seeing and what they were doing. And then he had David John Oates, who does reverse speech. Okay, and then he went back and reversed speech on Lee Harvey Oswald, and on the Dallas District Attorney, on J. Edgar Hoover, on Lyndon Johnson, on George Bush, and it's really incredible what they've come up with because they all agree. Okay, so what do they agree on? There was an ambush in Dealey Plaza. There were multiple gunmen firing from different locations. It was an orchestrated, high-level coup d'etat involving J. Edgar Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, probably George W. Bush, who was photographed in Dealey Plaza at the time, and he and Nixon were 2 of the people I can remember who couldn't seem to remember where they were when they heard Kennedy was shot. So it's really amazing, and it's all up there in the archives, so just go Google Rense.com and then go down and look at what the results of the remote viewing reverse speech is, and with my running commentary explaining things. You know, Dick Allgaier, for example, saw a young man coming down the street of a city being very confused, being felt like he's betrayed, and I explained to him that was Lee Harvey Oswald. He was told one thing, and then he was set up to be the patsy, and he finally realized that. In fact, he is recorded on sound and tape saying, I didn't shoot anybody, I'm just a patsy. Now think about this just a minute. This just boggles me every time I think about it. Here's the accused assassin. He says, I'm just a patsy, which implies he's been set up to take the blame. Now, we've had several federal investigations, starting with the Warren Commission, and then we had the House Select Committee on Assassinations. We've had the Assassination Records Review Board. We had the Church Committee. We've had 2 or 3 committees that supposedly looked into that. Did any one of them say, well, he said he's a patsy, let's look and see if we have any evidence that maybe he was set up? No, None of them have done that. They all started off with a preconceived conclusion that he did it all by himself, and then they cherry-picked their evidence to support that conclusion. That's not an investigation. Okay, I guess we're done. Thank you so much.